Irving Howe spent most of his life engaged in intellectual discourse while debating the merits of socialism, literature, and the working class. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a MacArthur Fellow and helped set the tone for left-wing ideas throughout the 20th century, starting right here in the alcoves of City College.
It was the 1930s, a time between two world wars and a time when Joseph Stalin had consolidated power in the Soviet Union. At the City College of New York, far from the USSR, debates were raging.
There was an atmosphere of fervid, overly heated, overly excited intellectuality.
This is Irving Howe, who was a young student at the college. He was in the thrall of Leon Trotsky, the Russian communist whose ideas directly opposed the authoritarian Stalinism of the time. The real center of life at City College was in our Alcove 1. Here gathered Trotskyists, socialists, with their books, pamphlets, ragged overcoats, and cheese sandwiches. You could walk into the thick brown darkness of Alcove 1 and find a convenient argument about the Popular Front in France, the New Deal in America, the Civil War in Spain, and what Marx really meant. In these early years, Howe's debate group included Irving Kristol, Daniel Bell, and Nathan Glazer. These four men would go on to have an outsized influence on American life in the 20th century. Howe grew up in a poor family in the East Bronx, where the roots of socialism began to percolate in the young thinker's mind.
I had some sense of first a little bit of self-pity, but then afterwards of indignation, and also a feeling that that our own experience in the slums in the East Bronx were not all that different from those of other people. Finally, it had a kind of liberating experience. It enabled one to see that one's life was shared with that of other people.
It was this concept of sharing life with other people, the empathy for others, that helped Howe consider ideas of democratic socialism, a political mode that gives voice to ordinary people, an idea fiercely opposed to the ruthlessness of capitalism and in favor of dismantling it while keeping democratic traditions afloat.
I think it's one of the virtues of this country. People do think that democracy is a pretty good thing.
And this idea captivated Howe. After graduating from City College, he served in World War II, albeit not on the front lines.
I had been partly transformed by my experiences in the Army. I spent 2 years in Alaska. It was like a graduate school for me. During that time, I read a good many books. There was nothing else to do up there. I began to develop incipient literary inclinations to move away from being just political. And I began to contribute a book review here, a book review there.
When Howe returned, he began in earnest his career as a writer, starting to shape mid-century intellectual life in America. This was a time in American history when the public intellectual was a force to be reckoned with, and one that shaped the politics of the time. Howe began to write for the Partisan Review, one of the most significant literary and political journals of the time. He contributed to other publications including Commentary, The New Republic, and the New York Review of Books. In other words, Irving Howe became a key contributor to the intellectual life of the nation. He was a renowned literary critic. He wrote on William Faulkner, Robert Frost, Sherwood Anderson, and others, but also put forth his democratic socialist ideas and social critiques. Towards the middle of the 1950s, he saw a profound schism in the thinking of people like his old debate nemesis, Irving Kristol.
In 1954, I published an article called This Age of Conformity, a kind of scattershot attack on the whole intellectual world for losing its tradition of intellectual independence, its social radicalism, its passion for criticism. The tendency in the intellectual world in the 1950s was toward conformity, was toward making peace with the status quo, or the status quo of American capitalist society, and I was against that.
And from this, in the shadow of the McCarthy hearings that cast a pall on the left in America, was birthed Dissent magazine. Howe founded Dissent alongside Louis Kozer as an answer to this conformity.
The purpose of this new magazine is suggested by its name, to dissent from the bleak atmosphere of conformism that pervades the political and intellectual life of the United States. To dissent from the support of the status quo, now so noticeable on the part of many former radicals and socialists. To dissent from the terrible assumption that a new war is necessary or inevitable, and that the only way to defeat Stalinism is through atomic world suicide.
Around the same time, Howe began to teach at City College, and he remained there for almost 25 years, also teaching at the Graduate Center. But in the mid-1950s, he saw that Irving Kristol had drifted further and further rightward politically, eventually inventing neoconservatism, which made the publication of Dissent that much more urgent. Howe stayed to the left politically, espousing democratic socialism through the pages of his magazine, for which he was the editor for many years.
The accent of Dissent will be radical. Its tradition will be the tradition of democratic socialism. We shall try to reassert the libertarian values of the socialist ideal, and at the same time to discuss freely and honestly what in the socialist tradition remains alive and what needs to be discarded or modified.
Howe's intellectualism had a place in the real world. In the early 1970s, he helped to start Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which merged with the Democratic Socialists of America in 1982. And if we move 30 years ahead, we can see that Bernie Sanders, himself a New York-born Jew and Brooklyn College alumni, carries the mantle of democratic socialism to the present day.
Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system which is corrupt, that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy.
And if, for example, there were a candidate in the next national election who represented what the young people would feel, what I would feel too, was a genuine sort of left liberal impulse for social change and for moral regeneration in the country, I think we'd find that thousands of kids would once again be out on the hustings, as would I.
In 1987, at age 67, Howe was awarded a MacArthur Award. He had also won a Guggenheim years before that. Howe remained relevant and engaged to the end of his life.
He was a man who stumbled into socialism, but his magazine, Dissent, remains in print today, with essays on topic titles like How to Repair the Planet, The Archaeology of Hope, and What Socialist Politicians Can Do. In other words, the foundation that Irving Howe built in 1954 has a through line to today. People still feel the urge to fight for the democratic socialism that Howe wrote about over hundreds of essays and dozens of books, over a lifetime dedicated to the mind and to the notion of a true democracy in America.
What about your own faith in the democratic institutions?
The one absolutely indispensable thing. I oppose anyone who, in the name of some better world, proposes to destroy the freedoms that we have. I want to see those freedoms expanded, enlarged, improved, and purified. But in order to do that, they first have to be preserved. There are a lot of violations of democracy, but in my debates with New Left students, I often had to explain that the fact that we have a violation of democracy does not mean that democracy is absent. On the contrary, it means that we have it.